Last part of the show.
Time?
Mark Schindler ISO time, folks. Mark Schindler on Malaki Branham. Let's dive deep. Go for it.
Yeah. I am so here for Malaki Branham. I don't remember if we'd ever talked about this, but I was like exceptionally high on him last year. Like I had a lot of regret on him. I thought that this was a guy that every year, people are looking for who's that, quote unquote star bet. And I thought it was him in this last draft in terms of like a guy who maybe flies in under the radar. Obviously was super young, was not at all expected to be a one and done guy at Ohio State and just popped after Ohio State had their COVID break. So I think what makes him so fascinating is watching what his development has been like this year, because I've kept up a lot with the Spurs just because they're in a really interesting spot of seeing a ton of guys develop. And he went from a guy who, and like, granted, like we have to be real, like the Spurs are not good right now. They are arguably the worst team in the NBA. They are they are relatively competitive still. Like they get blown out some for sure, but they even like the last like week or two, they've been in most of their games. I think when you're looking at a young player and how they're gauging, like I'm not looking like, yes, again, like there's levels to competitive basketball, but when I'm looking at, okay, Malaki Branham at the beginning of the season, first of all, I mean, he's not even starting off in San Antonio. He's, getting G League assignments at first, which good, like that's what he needed. When he was playing, he was looking like very all over the place. He was passing up a lot of threes. He was like just overall, like you could see a lot of hesitancy in his game. And I think over the last month, so like after Christmas, I think you could really start to see, because he became like just before Christmas, he became a regular rotation player for them. They decided to bring him up from the G League full time. And it was a little bit rocky for him at first, kind of finding his way as a ball handler. Like I think the mid-range scoring has popped the entire season. Like the pull-up shooting has been there. But like January, he really starts to find like the pacing and ability to just be this really funky, strong change of pace guard / wing. He's a weird mold with what his size is, but and then I think, later January, you started to see his pick and roll playmaking pop a little bit. Like he's getting better with hitting some of just finding his roller, like timing that stuff better. Because I think earlier in the year, you could see him really looking to make pocket passes and make the right pick and roll read, but he'd either do it too early or too late or premeditate it. And I think now you're starting to see him just kind of do it in the flow. And then February is hit. He's a full-time starter now. And let me just read off his February numbers because this is awesome. 8 games in February. So granted, it is a relatively small sample size, but it is meaningful. 18.1 points per game, 4 boards, 3 assists, 52% from the field, 41% from 3 on 6 a game. Not getting to the line very much, which that's a talking point with him for sure. The biggest thing for me is like, this is a guy who went from at St. Vincent St. Mary's, like he just did not shoot threes. He was not a 3-point shooter like at all.
Mid-range gunner.
Primarily just a mid-range guy. So that's why last year at Ohio State, like he originally was not even a starter, wasn't really taking threes at all for them. And then after the COVID break, whatever snapped for him, he was like, all right, I'm going to pull up. I'm going to start taking threes. It wasn't even that. I think he took like 3.5, 4 threes per game after the COVID break. It still wasn't even that much considering what his usage is. But to see him do it now, like, he's not hitting his pull-ups super well yet. I checked the numbers earlier today. I think he's like 3 of 20 on pull-ups, pull-up threes on the season. And almost all those have come, over the last month. But like he's finding ways to open himself up off the ball and be ready to shoot. And just doing all these things that he had not done it all last year. Like it was not accustomed to doing it all in high school. Wasn't really doing an AAU. So like the scoring growth has been really fast and really impressive from him in that regard. I was really high on what his shooting potential could be just because like he has ungodly touch at his size with what he does. Like, especially with how hard his diet is, like he's shooting like over 50% on floaters this year. And that's most of his shots are floaters and like tough leaners and faders. But I think again, like looking at all this, it's less about what the scoring is. It's more just the process overall. Like the level of comfort he's at, as I think he's the 8th youngest player in the NBA right now. He's like a week I was researching this earlier. He's a week older than Jeremy Sohan. And he just legitimately has been a good scorer who is comfortable handling the ball and pick and roll, making the right reads and getting off shots that are extremely difficult, and doing it well. Like, again, it's a small sample size, so you don't want to take too much from it. But I think this is the stuff that had me encouraged about him. Like, if you continue to see this kind of growth and process from him of continuing to find his game, figure out how to, like, because playing with Zach Collins has actually been really fun for him. Like, Zach Collins, I thought, was playing well all year, given what his role was. And now instead of having Jakob as the screener role threat, you have Zach, who brings some of the same things as a screener and DHO guy, not the same level of screener, but is a pretty good like DHO playmaker. But then you add that pop threat, and now I think that adds an interesting dynamic. I'm just really excited about what this can be, because you have the framework of a guy who, while noting he has real deficiencies as a rim scorer, like, I think what I'm interested by, like, because he is very strong, is can he really, like, one of the swing skills for him is going to be, what is his foul baiting craft? Like, that's going to be huge for him. Like, how can I draw free throws, use my arms, use my shoulders, use my length, and try and bait people into fouls? Because I do think that's going to be necessary for him to buoy his scoring a little bit. Because he's, like, I think he's dunked 3 times this year at most.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, the free throw numbers. In February, he's only gotten to the line in 3 games out of 8. And that's kind of the thing with him. Like, most of his free throw attempts from last year were, like, I mean, they call things differently in college to a degree. Like, part of that, you're bigger, faster, stronger, even if you're not, like, a vertical athlete. Like, he was 6'5" and could just bully people. And he has, to a degree, on some smaller guards this year. But again, like, what does it start to look like as defenses adjust is going to be really key. But again, like, I'm not to get too far ahead of myself, but, like, this is really exciting stuff, what he brings, because again, like, teams want guys who can handle the ball, that can make solid decisions. I've never thought he was a great field player, but I never thought he had bad feel for the game. And I actually think over the last month, like, you've seen his feel improve, and just continue to improve his court vision and how he feels in the court. And when you have a guy who can do these kind of things, that is flashing some of the ability to be a multi-level scorer on good efficiency and hit difficult shots with regularity, like, that's exciting shit. And that's why I was excited about him. That's why I'm going to be excited about him moving forward.
So 2 things I want to bring up that you sort of hit on one of them. You didn't really hit on the other one. The first one
defense
is
like, terrible. If you're about to hit on the defense, defense is abysmal.
That's the second thing, and I'll talk about that in a second. The first thing is just, like, the pace he plays at. He plays entirely at his own pace. There's never a point where he looks hurried. There's never a point where it feels like defenders can, like, get underneath him and bother him because of how strong he is, right? Like, he will take a ball screen, he'll pound dribble twice, put it between his legs, put it back between his legs, basically stop and pause in the mid-range, which is a really hard thing to do for young players, right? It's really, really hard for them with all of the length, all of the athleticism, everything that's flying around. It's often really, really hard for young players to just stop in that area and figure out what's going on and decide what to do and keep a defender on their hip, keep a defender, on their back. He does that really, really well. I think that's what I've been most impressed with, that has translated immediately. That's a difficult thing. Even guys that do that in college, especially teenagers transitioning to the NBA doing it, that doesn't always happen. It takes guys a long time to figure that out in many cases. That he has that already is what makes me think that, as you said, the process is good here. It's not a situation where the process is poor. He is able to just kind of hold his space. And even though he's not getting all the way to the rim, he is creating interesting opportunities both for himself and his teammates because he is such a good mid-range shooter. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's the thing that stands out to me most, even beyond the shooting, the touch, everything like that. That's the skill that I think translates really, really well to the NBA. is being
Yeah.
able to just get to your spot in the mid range, be comfortable, be unhurried, have your balance underneath you. That's what makes him such a good shooter in many cases. Like his balance, it feels like, is always, his
Always
center
on
of gravity is always underneath him.
Yeah. Yeah, he's awesome, man. I really like he just his get down is so fun to me, man. Like I like because exactly like you mentioned, there are not guys like him really. Like I think people can look at his
Well,
shot
it's
profile.
funny. Like this is a good example. Someone that you really like is Jalen Noel.
Yeah,
Jalen Noel is someone that does this really well too.
yeah. And what's fun too is like Malachi's so much better prospect too. But it's like
Yeah,
I mean I just
Malachi's
get Giddy
better than
talking.
Jalen
Yeah, yeah.
Noel.
I
Yeah,
just get Giddy talking about it, man. Like it's because like you mentioned, like the pacing, like they're just again, with how young he is, like so often I feel like most guys are coming into the league with all of their skills like super developed and refined, but they don't have that pacing. Like that's the stuff that
yeah,
takes a longer time for players to kind of figure out and get behind. But with him, like he's coming in with that already, and there just aren't a lot of guys who have that. So yeah,
yep,
super exciting to track moving forward because they are like again, not to discount anybody or like toss anybody aside, but as things have gone this season, I would say like obviously Vassell is at the top for me with what he's looked like. Obviously, he's had the injury, which has sucked. But Sohan has done really exciting things. I'd
yep.
argue that Malachi has probably been their third most exciting prospect this year with what he's done. Because
Are we just like moving on from Keldon Johnson?
I
Like
wouldn't.
not
I'm
is no
not
longer
sure I'm
being a
calling
prospect
Keldon a
anymore.
prospect right now. Like,
Yeah,
because he's. I
reasonable.
mean, he's a vet to me. Like, and he's still doing good and exciting things. It's been a weird year for him.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, like Blake Wesley has really struggled this year. Part of that. I mean, he's young too, but again, like he and
yeah.
Malachi are like the same age, so it's. I don't know. Just in terms of the way things are shaking out, it's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this season has gone as well as it could have for San Antonio, given that they came in with no vets, like very little lottery end, like high end lottery talent, and they've developed these guys really, really well. I think that Sohan looks great. I think that Branham looks really, really good. And if you hit 2 out of 3 with him and Branham and Wesley, you're going to be really happy. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I do want to talk about the defense very quickly, but in a different way that I think you want to talk about it,
Yeah.
or you don't want to talk about it. Yes, he's a really bad defender, and that's accurate. It's been accurate at Ohio State. Having said that, I watch a lot of Ohio State because, of course, I do. I went to Ohio State. I love the university.
Watched a
I
lot of Ohio State this year. Woof.
It's
The
not
Iowa
great.
game yesterday, not good.
Yeah, they're in the midst of a disaster season. And they're in the midst of a disaster season because their defense is terrible, right? I'm starting to wonder because we're going through this right now with Bryce Sensabaugh, right? Like Bryce Sensabaugh's defense is really bad too. How much of it is these are two specific prospects that just had 2 very weak defensive games? And I think they've always had weak defensive games. You go back and you watch Branham's tape at the prep level, you go back and you watch Bryce's game at the prep level. It was not good. They were both very bad defenders. Is this like an evaluation thing where the Ohio State coaching staff is not caring enough about defense? Is it a teaching thing where they're not teaching it well enough? But we now do have like a fairly unfortunate track record of the last 3 years where they finished 82nd, 111th. Right now, they're 110th in defensive efficiency, according to Ken Palm. I don't know, man. Like I'm wondering if Branham, I guess, being in that San Antonio system, playing for Greg Popovich, maybe there's a case that the defense comes around, I guess is where I'm at.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think it can come around. It's going to be more dependent for me. Like, he's really going to have to get better with angles and stuff because he's in a weird spot of like, as good as he is with like, uh, shoulder dipping around screens as an offensive player, and taking angles and being adept with that. He is so bad at that defensively, which I think that's stuff you can learn, but that's going to be a ton of reps because, like, as solid as his feel for the game is offensively, I think his feel for the game as a defender is pretty bad.
Yeah.
Like I don't think that his foot speed is like terrible and he has wingspan, but he's just in a weird spot with what his build is
But
and what
yeah,
his
like how
archetype
much of
is.
that is teaching versus like how much of this is teachable versus just like innate feel is going to be a really interesting. He's going to be a really interesting case study for that because
Yeah.
he's coming from a really bad scenario seemingly for that, going to a really good scenario playing for Greg Popovich and the Spurs, who for like 2 straight decades up until the last 2 years where they've gone full youth movement, have been unbelievable defensively.
Yeah.
So like he should theoretically be, this should be like a really good test case, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm positive. Like I'm fairly optimistic that he can get to be like a neutral defender. I don't think he's ever going to be a significant positive. But I think like he definitely, like exactly you mentioned, it's one of the bigger swing skills for him. You know, like I think arguably like those things become.
It's why I was lower on him than you
Yeah.
pre-draft. I did
Those
not like
things
the
are
defense at
like
all.
they end up being the bigger swing skills. I'm like, okay, well, does this guy continue to get more minutes to develop out that offensive game? So having that defensive ability to be able to stick, especially in like, but that's part of why San Antonio was a good place for him, because he's not going to have some of the same like he's going to get more leeway than he would be if he was in a place that is in a more like I know a lot of Raptors fans have like really wanted, like every time I tweet about Malaki, like that's our pick. Like, you know, I'm like, I do not think Malaki fits anything of what they want in Toronto. Like I get it, you know, just from a straight up looking at the pick, but it's an important reminder of how important environment is, because I don't think that he would thrive in Toronto right now.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I for what it's worth, I had Malaki at 21 last year and talked a lot about basically like all of the offensive like skill. It's just that I just didn't think that what I was wrong on is that I think he can make his play style work efficiently. Like I had real like questions about whether or not that would be effective. I also had real questions about the shot as well. Like his pre-draft shooting was apparently really bad. If you talk to teams, he was trying to go through some mechanical adjustments, I guess, and it just was not working in the way that we had hoped. And by the way, he's still shooting 31% from 3. Like these last few games have been really, really good. Like what is it, 7 or 8 games? But he is 31% from 3 so far this year. So that's really the swing skill, is him shooting from distance consistently. And if he can't do that, it's going to be hard. But the creativity, like I actually really buy the ability now to like get into the areas that he needs to get into, I guess is what I would say.